All right, now here we go for the late and great Headhunter panel. It's been a fantastic conference. We're going to run through this fast before we then go on the water and drink copious amounts of alcohol. The experience known as Forbes Highlander. So please join me, take your seat, listen up, because the fact is, frankly, based on some of the stuff I see here, some of us could be looking for new jobs in the very next 6 months, and maybe these guys can help us. I know I may be looking. All right, so this is the panel, our Headhunter panel. Now, our conference people very shrewdly schedule this at the very end so that people stick around to get some free advice from guys who are otherwise charging thousands and thousands of dollars. So 4 years ago, senior executives, CEOs in particular, could do no wrong. They filled up the gossip columns and the party appearances. They were fabulously wealthy. They were swashbucklers. They were heroes of capitalism. Then came the bubble burst, and suddenly CEOs can do no right. Today, they're targets in the line of fire. We pass entire laws aimed at forcing the CEO personally to sign off on financials where he says, to the best of my knowledge, the numbers are right. It's like we don't trust him anymore. And we're just constantly waiting for you guys to do the slightest things that might screw up. So what are the tools the CEO needs for survival? And what can we learn from the political system as well? If you look at what Bush might have done if he were a CEO before Iraq and what he might have done after is another area we could get into. So with us today to discuss this is a quite impressive panel. Starting to the far, far right is Michael Wellman. He is chairman of Jefferson Partners. He is the one pure, real, true headhunter on this panel. For those of you who are looking for new assignments, this is the man on the far right in the yellow tie that you're going to want to suck up to. Michael Wellman has been in the search business for 20 years. He started as a consultant at Bain Consulting. He was at Korn Ferry International. He was the chief talent officer at Comstellar Tech, which is a private equity firm. He was planning people there. And now he's running Jefferson Partners. Next to him is Marshall Goldsmith. Now, if you have not heard of Marshall Goldsmith, my guess is you will very soon. This guy is one of the hottest, on-the-scene executive coaches. It turns out CEOs, even though they end up running huge multi-billion-dollar agglomerations, they need a little coaching. And Marshall specializes in that, and he especially focuses on, before you try to change your organization, you got to look inside yourself and see what needs to change first. Before you try to change your senior staff or change their practices, figure out and start inside your own self. And then next to Marshall is Tom Stern. Now, Stern runs Stern Executive Search, which does searches for higher level and mid-level people, not necessarily CEO. But he also is the author of CEO Dad, comic strip, which you've seen in our program here, and which is occasionally funny. And that was a joke, and apparently that wasn't that funny. And the thing that Tom really likes to focus on is work-life balance, and how can that be an asset and a skill set that executives need to keep in mind. So on with the panel. Let's look at the skill set that it took to be a CEO, gentlemen, say 10 or 20 years ago, versus the skill set that is required now and how that has changed. And Marshall, because you nodded your head the most, please begin.
We just finished doing a study called Global Leader of the Future, and what they found out was the first thing in terms of characteristics of the new CEO as opposed to the old one. Number one was global thinking, understanding globalization, cross-cultural diversity, being able to work across cultures, technological savvy, not being a technological expert, but being able to understand and use technology, building partnerships and alliance, which 20 years ago wasn't seen as a critical competency for a CEO, and it is today. And the final one was called sharing leadership, which is basically managing knowledge workers. How many of you out there manage people that know more than you do? Well, it's kind of hard to tell them what to do and how to do it because they already know more than us. So it's managing people who know more than we do. So those were the 5 competencies that came
again for us. Repeat it, please.
Oh, shit.
No,
Number one, global thinking, cross-cultural understanding, building partnerships and alliances, sharing leadership, knowledge management, and technological savvy.
Man, very good. Okay, nicely done. Michael Wellman, tell me whether he left out any new skill sets that today's CEO needs that someone didn't 20 years ago. You know, Carly Fiorina at HP likes to say that leadership is a performance, that a certain amount of showmanship is required. What do you think?
Well, I think the person has to have a personality that will translate in terms of executive presence, and that's always been the case. But I think, you know, just to add to what Marshall said, you've got to have strong financial skills and acumen today. I mean, Sarbanes-Oxley and other compliance matters make that now a higher quality that's looked for in CEOs just because of the current setting. And the second thing is you have to withstand an enormous amount of due diligence. Due diligence is going on both sides, but companies are certainly looking deeply into backgrounds. They don't want to be embarrassed. They understand that the media and other stakeholders are going to look at what, you know, that background is when they make the announcement of who's been hired. And so guess who has to be sure that that person is squeaky clean? You know, so that's a new dimension.
Tom Sturt, getting into this due diligence and background checks, any idea, if you had to guess, in all the searches you've done over the last 10 years, let's say, what portion do you think there was something falsified on a resume in the finalist candidates that you guys were looking at?
It's hard to know. I mean, it really is. My wife is a private investigator, and so...
Well, I'm thinking you're never going to cheat on her, are you?
Well, it's worse than that. She knows when I've had a naughty thought. She'll actually...
Okay.
So she was always helpful to me in some of the background checks. I like to think that nothing got through. You never know. I don't think resumes are doctored by serious candidates that are senior. I think that it's more insidious than that. I think it has to do with behavior and the way you relate to other individuals and your ethical fiber and your character. But if you have any street smarts at all, you're not going to reflect that in a piece of paper that can be so easily assessed.
And it is more easily assessed now today than ever before. Marshall, not to dwell on this too much, and honestly, I swear I'm not talking about a personal problem, but if I have something false on my resume, what should I do about that? And I'm now in a good job, but there is a lie or a stretch on my resume. What should I do about that? Just leave it?
No. No. Get rid of it.
But don't alert anybody?
No, I mean, that's to me out of the question. So I'd say you shouldn't have something false on your resume to start with, and if you did, you're better off telling people. What do you think?
You know, there was this recent case in New York City schools, right, where an administrator who'd been with the school system for 20 years, was a teacher, was then a principal, then an administrator, curriculum director, apparently never went to college. It was all bogus, and they fired her for it. And I mean, I couldn't help feel a little bit bad, because on the other hand, hey, she's got 20 years of experience in the school, but it was enough to ruin her entire career, probably for the rest of her life. All right, so where should we go with this now? Let's talk about how much harder it is to get hired these days because of the post-scandal era. Michael, go ahead and talk a little about Sarbanes-Oxley and the headhunting task ahead for that.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the due diligence aspect, I think, raises the order of difficulty for both sides of the equation. I mean, you have both the executive having to withstand that kind of scrutiny, but the executives today are looking so carefully at the organizations that are contemplating that they're looking into. They're doing their homework to make sure they really understand whether that company has any particular issues, any kind of liabilities that they might not know about. They're doing a lot of homework before they will read for a part. So you have that order of difficulty that has to be managed on both sides. The other dimension is, frankly, I think most of these individuals that are looking for opportunities, you know, they're looking very much at private companies over and above public companies if they have good opportunities.
Today they are now? More so?
That's correct.
CEO candidates more looking private rather than public. Why is that? Because of Sarbanes-Oxley?
That's one issue, the liability dimension of D&O insurance and the issues of serving in that capacity. I mean, they're looking at the opportunities financially as well in the private sector, you know, the private companies, private equity programs.
Okay. And before we cut to Marshall on something, tell us, Mike, is turnover in the CEO suite up? I mean, how many CEOs do you figure in the past year left their jobs?
Well,
you have some
voluntarily
data?
Voluntarily or involuntarily. Booz Allen has been doing a study on CEO turnover the last several years, and back in May, they actually issued a press release that turnover for 2003 was just a slight amount less than it was in 2002, but significantly higher than it had been in the previous years. Almost 10% of the 2,500 companies that they studied had CEO turnover.
10%.
You know, that's 250 executives who left voluntarily or involuntarily not due to merger,
Right.
not due to change of control.
Now, often when they leave, it's because the shareholders, I guess, feel like they screwed up. I mean, I was surprised that when Carly Fiorina had like 1 or 2 bad quarters, boom, right away we started hearing she's out of there, she's dead. Never mind that she took a company that some people felt was in big trouble, and that this is the first toast of. So Marshall, tell us, do you think it's any more difficult now for a CEO to succeed than it was 10 or 20 years ago? What is it about today where there seems to be a higher casualty rate?
More press scrutiny. I think there's much more pressure on the CEO today, much more public visibility, much more press exposure than there ever was before. Also, less tolerance for failure. That's not all good. Too much short-term focus.
Tom?
Well, I think they've said a lot. I think another issue is the work-family life balance issue. I do think there is so much pressure. There is a kind of strategy or a vision that happens maybe even above the CEO that churns them, and that they're so driven to meet these results and to handle all these pressures and the scrutinization that goes on, and they don't have enough balance in their life with their families because of the logistical issues and the traveling and everything else, that it's easier to burn out. And I just think that there is less attention placed on the human being, the CEO as human being, not just as leader and as symbol and as front man for the organization.
The CEO is human being. Now, that's actually a pretty good thought. Have any of you gentlemen aware of any studies that show that a CEO with good balance in his work and family life, that company fares better in terms of shareholder returns than one who's a total Lou Gerstner workaholic, run, travel 1 million miles a year? Any studies that show it?
Yeah, well, that's one of the problems. More people are starting to write about it, and I think it's being explored. But really, it's a greenfield, and the data isn't there. I do think, though, that a lot of these thoughts that I'm saying will grow into the promise of their logic. And it just is a certain logic about human beings and common sense that I'm trying to apply. And of course, I'm not alone. That is a part of what is the work-life balance integration movement. I think that we need those studies, and I think we need to gather that information so we can make proper assessments. But common sense would dictate that some humanity that is injected in terms of the lifestyle of the individual is positive for this reason alone. I think that when you don't have a balanced life and you don't have a connection with your family because of work, there is pain. There's pain in the individuals that are waiting for you at home. There's pain when they are tough on you because of their own frustration and deprivation. And whenever there is pain, there is generally less efficiency. Just talk to athletes, talk to anybody in a profession. So that's the logic that I think supports the movement.
That's a good point. Marshall, this idea of the swashbuckling CEO as leader, which we loved in the 1990s, we loved right up to the bubble, is it time now for a lower profile leader, or is that high public profile just as important as it was in better times?
I think the public profile is fine. The style of the CEO, typically in a knowledge organization, is changing. One of my clients is CEO now of one of the 20 biggest companies in the world, and since he's been CEO, I said, what's the #1 problem you face as a CEO? What's the #1 thing you've learned? He said, I've learned one hard lesson. My suggestions become orders.
My suggestions become orders.
Yeah, he said, I don't want them to be orders sometimes. I don't mean for them to be orders. No matter what we say, my suggestions become orders. And he said, I asked him, I said, what'd you learn from me when I was your coach? He said, I learned one thing that really helped me. I said, what was it? He said, it's simple. Before I speak, stop, take a breath, and ask myself one question. Is it worth it? And he said, as CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, in the past year, 50% of the time I've done that. You know what I've decided? Am I right? Maybe. Is it worth it? No.
And so he just holds back.
Did he ever suggest that you cut your fees? And did you take that as an order?
That's interesting. I think a lot of CEOs, there is that problem. You get into this cone of sycophancy where everyone tells you every idea you have is great, and do you ever really get hold of truth? All right, let's say that...
Dennis, before you leave that point, one thing that I think we heard earlier today is how important it is to have a terrific team. You know, have that next generation of leadership as part of your team.
Right.
And I think one of the things that you try to do with that team is to have a very candid, transparent, open debate about the character of the business or decisions that are being made. So the CEO, the CEOs that I find myself having the most respect for really do encourage that with their people, and they put people first and foremost in their day.
And that's certainly a change from the from the era of the 90s. Because back then, you know, to hear the media tell it, we acted like these guys were doing it alone.
Right.
The idea of a more team approach. And the other good thing is that when something goes wrong, you can blame your team, okay, and hold on to your job.
Well, also, one thing that I did neglect to mention when you asked me if there's any data, there isn't directly necessarily on, you know, work, life, family, integration, and all that, but Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, did assess companies that had tremendous growth over a period of time, and he determined that the CEOs that he felt were the most effective were not fitting that swashbuckling image that you were talking about. They were humble men, they cared about their people, they had a certain sense of loyalty, they were very down to earth. So that was accumulated data that one could extrapolate to some of the other issues I was talking about.
Right. So let's talk about change inside the company. You're the CEO, you get in place, you see this place is screwed up, I got to fix it. And Marshall, go ahead and talk about where you should look first. He or she.
Well, look at the key behaviors you're going to need to fix the company. First thing you got to be is a role model for those behaviors yourself. I just listened to Jamie Dimon talk about what he did in Bank One, and one of the impressive things he did is he went back to the board and said, here's the goals, here's my measures, I'm going to be evaluated on success or failure of this. And he really did a great job of leading through his own personal accountability, which then it's a lot easier to take it down to the next level and say, here's what I expect of you. Because he started with, here's what you can expect from me.
Anyone else on that?
Well, use of communication and technology in a company these days. I mean, there's fabulous opportunities. CEOs are getting the word out personally through voicemails,
Yes.
you know, through emails, and they're really putting their own stamp on their company in a way
Because
they couldn't do.
internal communication can be even more important than communication with the outside world. Okay.
And I think there's been a flattening in the organization, which is, I think, what you're talking about in terms of communication. With the internet and with the shared information, the sense of hierarchy has been reduced.
Good.
And that gives an opportunity for the chief executive to create relationships that maybe 20 years ago they couldn't have done with more people.
Good. Marshall Goldsmith, if I'm trying to look inward and figure out what I need to change so that my company operates better, where do I even start? The fact is, I think I'm pretty terrific. So how do you even figure out how to assess yourself without hiring you at $650 an hour, or whatever your fee might be?
It's a lot more than that.
I was just going to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have no idea whether he's kidding or not. But go
He's
ahead.
not. He's not kidding. Trust me. I'm sure he's not.
Well, what I teach people to do is learn from everyone around you. And learn from the people that you respect. And what I teach people is to reach out and learn from people around them. Let me give you two case studies of CEOs who I think done a great job of this. One is Steve Sanger. He's the CEO over at General Mills, and he's done a fantastic job of reaching out, getting his colleagues involved. He said, here's what I'm trying to improve. He's done a great job of improving in that stuff, and is able to talk to employees about it. Another one is Michael Dell, CEO of Dell. Huge write-up about how he's reached out to his employees in Dell and learned and grown from them, and basically said, here's what I've learned from all of you. This stuff is not easy for me to fix. Here's what I'm doing to fix it. Michael Dell doesn't have to say that. You know what he could say? I'm Michael Dell. You aren't. You know, I'm the world's youngest billionaire. You aren't. You know, what's the name of the company? Dell. That's my name.
Right.
He takes the opposite approach. And
Right.
one final example, since you're here from Northrop Grumman, is I think your predecessor, Kent Kressa, was an outstanding role model of a leader who did just what I said, reached out, got employees involved, didn't act like a big shot, and did a spectacular job of turning the company around. So that's my assessment. I don't know if you agree with me or not.
But Mike Wellman, should a CEO ever be so bold as to say, I'm looking inward here, I'm trying to figure out what I need to change in me first, so here I'm going to go to my dozen most frequent contacts and ask them, what's my weakness? Should a CEO ever do a thing like that?
Absolutely.
Yes?
I mean, I don't think that that's a sign of being, you know, not having confidence or insecurity. Quite the contrary. I would think that's
Oh, it's a sign of being really insecure, and my theory is that 90% of CEOs are incredibly insecure. Insecurity drives excellence. It drives trying hard. Do any of you know a CEO who has done that, who has gone to 12 lieutenants and said, tell me what's wrong with me?
I know lots of CEOs who've done
Is that right?
I mean,
Kent Kressa did that. Let me guess. I bet you do that.
And the best CEOs are looking for constant improvement, and they apply those lessons to themselves, not just to their company and to the teams around
Right.
them.
I don't think there's any real, absolute formula that's not to in any way undercut what you do, because you have a methodology, and certainly methodologies are necessary in terms of penetrating defenses and enhancing capability of any executive. I do think part of it is not just getting feedback, which is important, but also just doing your own gut check about yourself. One of the most talented executives I ever knew was a guy who passed away recently named David Schneider. He ran all of e-commerce for PricewaterhouseCoopers and then Nextera for Michael Milken. And his ability, his talent, was that he was an intellectual and he challenged everyone intellectually. He was really brutal with them. Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? And he would argue with them constantly, but he counterbalanced it with an incredible ability to have fun with them. So he created a collegiality, almost like, a rugby team or a football team or something like that. And he knew that that was his strength, that he could work them that hard and then play that hard with them. And he intuitively understood that by counterbalancing those two aspects of his personality, he was effective, and he built incredible loyalty and retention.
Anytime that all three members of your three-member panel are nodding their heads in agreement, it gets a little boring. So now let's look for some conflict and see if we can get them to disagree.
How about if we all turn on you?
That's happened before. So let's talk about...
I want to be your coach.
All right, so now I've looked inward, and I've talked to my 12 people, and they've told me why I suck, and now I'm seeking to change myself. And now we're moving forward with the company. And but then I'm encountering enemies, okay? And I want to talk for a minute about enemies. And I want to talk about internal enemies and external enemies. Now, yesterday at lunch, Michael Eisner, bless him, the president and CEO, just stripped of the chairman title. Michael Eisner could tell us a thing or two about external enemies, right? You got Roy Disney, the nephew of Walt Disney, who is just doing everything he can to make Michael Eisner's life a living hell.
And also Goofy.
Yes.
Goofy has turned on him.
Yes, he has. And so that's external enemies. And Eisner, some people would say, has done a very bad job of dealing with his external enemies. For example, Roy Disney told us at Forbes in a visit that Disney cut his private jet reimbursement from $650,000 in 2002 to $126,000 in 2003. Mm-hmm. Now, call me crazy, but I'm really thinking a $20 billion a year Disney. Michael Eisner might have wanted to say, you know what, give the guy a little more for his jet, maybe it'll be a little friendlier. So that's external enemies. Now, internal enemies. Tell me, which do you think is worse and harder to overcome, internal or external? The example of internal, Howell Raines, the editor of the New York Times. This big Jason Blair liar writer scandal happened. Howell Raines, who was 20 levels up, ends up getting fired, but it really was less about Jason. It was more because his enemies inside the company who hated him used this and killed him with it. So that was internal enemies. So Mike, what do you think is harder, internal or external?
Well, I think the external part is probably more difficult to overcome. And you don't control those people. They're probably picking on you because of performance issues. Okay. I mean, more often than not, their emotional reaction to you and your position is because of poor performance. And that's something you cannot ignore.
So to fix the performance, you can fix the external enemy, perhaps. Marshall, what do you do about internal enemies? What should people here do if they know they have a faction inside the company that wants to see them fail?
Well, let me describe enemies in a couple of ways you can look at an enemy. If you look at someone you don't trust, simple advice, get rid of them as soon as humanly possible. Number one regret CEOs have is, in my gut, I knew I should get rid of them. I waited too long. If you don't trust them, get rid of them. It's not going to work. I'm going to give you a qualifier, though, about what an enemy isn't. And I think our gentleman from Google did a good job. An enemy is not someone who disagrees with you and argues with you. A person that you do trust, who stands up to you, disagrees with you, and argues with you, they're not an enemy. They may be a pain in the butt, but they're not an enemy. An enemy is that person you don't trust. Don't trust them, get rid of them sooner, not later. Number one regret of CEOs, and this is pretty well published, in my gut, I knew I should have acted on it. I waited too long. You're getting paid to run the company. They're paying you for your judgment. If in your heart you say this ain't going to work, pull the plug.
Don't waste your time.
No, well, you're going to be very, very frustrated with me, and you'll probably become my enemy. But I have to say that I agree, actually, with what they're saying. Michael made a very good point, which is, external enemies you can't control because, and I don't know if you echoed it in this way, but because you can take an internal enemy and make them an external enemy. You can't do the opposite. So that's one point. Secondly, I do think there has to be a continuum of evaluating individuals who are opposed to you, and that's what Marshall's talking about. Because if you turn people who disagree with you or people who you have conflict with and you perceive them as enemies, then you escalate that conflict unnecessarily. I mean, who knows where Eisner and Disney started out? We know where they ended up. But maybe they started out in a smaller place that wasn't quite as, there wasn't quite as much stratification or cognitive dissonance or whatever the heck was their problem. And if there had been an intervention at that time, it might not have escalated. We know that they ended up as real enemies. So sometimes there are people where initially there is a gut check and you've got to get rid of them, and sometimes you create enemies by perceiving them that way and escalating the conflict.
So you have to be aware of your enemies, but you have to try not to instantly assume that anyone who disagrees should be shot. Okay? Mike Wellman. So I've fixed myself internally. I've asked my lieutenants. I've taken care of my internal enemies. They're in a gulag. I'm working on performance for my external enemies. And then I screw up and have a huge failure. So let's talk for a minute about the way a CEO should respond at a time of a huge failure. You know, if you look at our ultimate CEO, George W., you know, he went into Iraq and he was bold and he got rid of a guy that we should get rid of. But then we didn't find the weapons thing. And so to this day, President Bush has never come out and said, hey, we screwed up. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway, but instead he's insisted, I'll do the same thing all over again, which some people believe makes him look even worse. So what are like 3 cardinal rules when you screw up?
I have to admit, I'm sitting here, how do I handle this question?
I want you to know I already agree with you.
You want me to answer this one first? Give you some
Want
time
to
to think?
give me a chance here?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'll go next. Give me
Okay,
some
all
time.
right, Mr. Know-it-all.
I'll pick on both candidates, right? So I want to be equal opportunity here. George Bush, you know what he should have said? There were no weapons of mass destruction. I thought there were. In good conscience, I believe this was right. I learned there weren't. I made a mistake. Get on with life. John Kerry, I never changed my mind. Please, you know what he should say? I did change my mind. I did change my mind. I got new data. I changed my mind. Here's why I changed my mind. Get on with life. It's obvious he changed his mind. Just admit it. Your turn.
Is there too much of a reluctance on the part of the leaders in American business? Is there too much of a reluctance to admit weakness, to admit, hey,
Absolutely.
I kind of messed that one up?
I mean, I'll just give one example, although it's not. You okay, Mike?
Go right ahead.
All right.
Attack him, Mike. Go after him.
What do you want, a wrestling match here? Do you want costumes? What are you looking for?
I'm looking for men in tights. Is what I'm looking for.
Get to me.
Go ahead.
We're having a conversation. Oh my God. Well, this is just from Larry King, where I get all my information. So that'll tell you a little about me. But Martha Stewart was on, and he was quoting her from her previous visit and saying that she had said her life is her work and her work is her life. And he said, don't you think that in some ways that's a little sad? And I thought it was a reasonable question and a reasonable assumption. And she said, no. And she looked him right in the eye, and it was almost as if, you know, that's the way she's been trained. Nothing is sad. There's nothing, because sadness is weakness. Sadness is maybe a remorse and regret and all those kinds of things, which she would not allow him to perceive as a possibility. And I think, as Marshall was saying, again, to agree with someone up here with me, that that was a mistake. Why couldn't she have said, sometimes it's sad. Sometimes I had regrets about the sacrifices I made, but I knew in the end that I made the right decision. Where is this dehumanizing, the two-dimensionalizing of the individual because they're a leader? To me, that was a classic example.
Yes, we're afraid to admit weakness. Go ahead, Mike.
Dennis, when when a CEO makes a mistake and has a big mistake, okay, the question of performance is still at the heart of it. And so the issue here is what the board, in fact, feels they must do. And in today's environment, boards make a change. I hate to say it, even though that executive will be totally honest and clean and say mea culpa, you know, the buck stops there. And that's what they sign up for when they take that position. Now, in most organizations, though, you need to have a culture that will allow people to make some mistakes. But it's a matter of degree. I don't know of any CEO that has a philosophy of total perfection, and the moment somebody tries something, you know, you cut down on renovation, you cut down on taking risks. So when it comes to the CEO making a mistake, it depends, again, on whether the board is going to view that as a case of poor performance and do they need to make a change.
Okay.
But that's life.
All right. We're riding this baby down. We're almost gone. We're coming into the home stretch. Just so you know, emotionally, I want you people to be prepared for separation emotionally.
The kind of letdown that they're going to go through.
So now, let's say that I'm a big guy in a company. I'm the number 2 guy, and I'm wanting to be the number 1 guy. And then, let's say Michael Eisner comes out a week or 2 ago, and he says, I'm going to step aside. I'm going to retire in 2006. Now, Bob Iger is number 2. Bob Iger wants that job badly. But a lot of people in Hollywood feel like he doesn't deserve it. So Eisner announces it, but they don't say that Iger's definitely going to get the job. Let's cut to one other example. Coke. Steve Heyer, I believe his name was the number 2 guy at Coke. Number 1 guy bails out. He waits. The board says, we're going to do an international search. And we in the media were thinking, Heyer's got it. They're just kind of putting window dressing. And then he doesn't get it. So what I want to know is the number 2 guy, Bob Iger at Disney, you're advising him, should he quit right now? Or should he continue earning out and hope that he can get that job in 2006 when Eisner steps aside? Go ahead, Mike.
I think it all depends on what he feels his relationship with the board is and what he thinks will come from that. If he doesn't feel he has the confidence of that board, then he probably should step out.
Okay.
I was quoted in Fortune, and I was the only one that was quoted.
I'm sorry, you were quoted.
I was quoted in Fortune on the article, the Coke article, that other magazine.
Yeah.
I was quoted in that other magazine. Basically, I said leave, and he left. So he must have listened to me. What the hell?
Now you're billing him $25,000. Okay, so now I'm thinking, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. This is my last question. I'm out of here. I'm number 2. They're not going to make me number 1. This is truer than you people realize. And I'm leaving. What is the very first thing a high-ranking, powerful executive should do? I want to leave. What is the first thing they should do? All 3 of you.
Well, Bob Pittman took about a year off. I mean, that was what he did, to be with his family. And he said, I'm going to regird myself. I'm going to, look and develop a fresh point of view. And that was the way he kind of dealt with the storm that was around him and all the controversy was at AOL, et cetera. And that was his approach. So for him, that worked. I don't know what it is for Iger. I mean, some people could, jump right into another position if they really feel it's right for them. Again, I'm equivocating, but I just don't know if there's one answer.
Okay, Mike Wellman, what's the first thing I do? I want to quit. I'm out of here. What's the first thing?
Yeah, you take a week or 2, but that's it. Get yourself back in the game, and have time to get organized, to plan, to call the friends and other members of your trusted circle, but move forward. Don't take a year off,
Okay.
because you'll vanish.
Marshall, should I wait for you guys to find me and hear that I'm looking, or should I actually be so bold as to give you guys a call?
Give a call. Figure out what you want to do the rest of your life, then call your friends, get on with life. I wouldn't wait too long.
And do I give a call and say, let's have coffee, or do I give a call and cut to the chase? Hey, I'm not happy, I'm looking around.
Cut to the chase.
Cut to the chase.
Yeah.
All right, that's going to close this panel. They want to make a couple closing remarks. So I just got like 30 seconds, 60 seconds. When we began yesterday, I talked about the politics of business, but also the politics of hope and how important hope is to capitalism. Now, I think that in the panels, we saw plenty of reason to worry about stuff and to be uncertain. We saw there's the rise of Asia, which could be a big competitor. And there's how do you deal with the media? And there's corporate governance after the scandals, right? And yet at the same time, I see plenty of reasons for optimism and hope. I mean, there is the rise of Asia, an incredibly cheap supplier. I mean, millions of Americans are buying $65 DVDs at Walmart, and call me crazy, but I think that cannot be a bad thing. There's offshoring, which is a good thing for business. There's post-scandal governance, where we're going to do a better job of running our companies and reining in the people who go too far. And so there's plenty of reason for both. An extra theme I thought, though, that I had not anticipated, that did show up here, is we could be on the brink, perhaps, of a new era of soulfulness inside the company. I mean, it's interesting that Marshall talks about looking inside yourself. Tom Stern talks about work-life balance and needing to be happier at home before you can be more thriving at work. Keith Ferrazzi, the networking guy, talked about revealing a vulnerability to someone else, being more human, and focusing on what you can give in networking instead of what you can get. And if you harness enough of those things together, I think we're looking at kick-ass economic growth and an 11, 12,000 Dow in a year or 2. So thank you so much for listening and for your indulgence. We're getting ready to load up and go on the boat. And I think overall been a fantastic conference because of the people in this crowd. And so if we will join in applauding, all of you applauding yourselves. And if you'll thank the panel members, because I think you guys did a good job. Thanks very much.